Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So an exciting thing happened over the last, I guess it's about a week or so, at least since I first noticed this and started to hear about it. As you would imagine, as someone who has quite a few apps, I submit to the App Store on a pretty regular basis. Usually I'll have at least an app or two in review at any given time. And I noticed something a bit funny. My app started to get through review really quickly. And in fact, this is now sort of gone from being this sort of a freak occurrence, which I've had before. In the past, I've had like a freak app review that just went through in a day or two, or I think I've even had a couple that went through in a few hours. And, who knows what that is. But this has happened now 3 times in a row, where my last app reviews have taken 27, 25, and 17 hours, respectively. And I've started to hear more generally from app developers that this is a thing now, that whatever is causing this to happen is a consistent thing. It isn't just my account. And if you go to App Review Times, which is this lovely little community-sourced site that Dave Ur, who's the guy who also does the iOS Dev Weekly newsletter, runs, where you can submit your App Review Times, it seems like this is a thing that the vast majority of apps that are, people who have submitted their app review times recently are saying that it's taking, a day or two, somewhere between, 1 or 2 days, which is a massive departure from what we had before. And, certainly it's fair to have the side note. Obviously, yes, I know Android has no review time and it's amazing and it's wonderful, but this is the world in which the iOS App Store lives and has lived for a very long time, where for as long as I can remember, the app review has taken about a week. Sometimes it takes a bit less than a week, typically around big updates. So like in September, sometimes things will speed up a little bit because, there's a new update, lots of updates coming out. Apple wants to get those ready for the new phones. Great. Sometimes it can get a bit slower. Sometimes it can be, 10 days, 2 weeks. But I would say about a week has been what it's been for 7 or 8 years now. And how all of a sudden it seems like, fingers crossed, Apple has changed something in their process, in their staffing, in their automation, in who knows what. But they're doing something that's meaning that app review is taking a day. And that seemed like a pretty big deal and something that we should talk about, because I feel like a lot of the ways in which I approach development are in many ways sort of they're working backwards from it. It's whenever I submit, it's going to be a week until that shows up in the store. And so if you change that calculus to essentially be a day, then a lot of things about the way, updates that I think are big enough or good enough to go to actually submit, or things might change. And just in general, like it's good for a lot of reasons. And there's also some tricky things that I think will also be worth updating. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm as surprised as anybody because, as you said, like, it has been about a week, whether it was 6 days or 8 days, like, it's been about a week for almost the entire history of the App Store. And we should clarify the iOS App Store. The Mac App Store has gone all over the map because it seems to have gotten a lower priority most of its life. And so the Mac App Store times have often been as high as like 30 days, which was horrible. And that's pretty crippling to any actual efforts to get quality software into the market. But on iOS, it's been pretty much a week forever. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I think Apple is pretty clearly setting internal metrics of whatever guideline they consider to be good enough. They hit that guideline, and it's pretty obvious that for most of the history of the App Store, that's been a week. And there's lots of reasons why Apple might want to not get faster. And one of the biggest ones, obviously, is the faster they review apps, the more frequently people will submit updates. So just it'll increase the total volume of updates that they're going to have to deal with, which will increase their cost, increase the size of that team that the team has to be, etc. And as you get more and more people in this in the app review team, you're probably going to have more mistakes made, and that increases the risk of angering developers, getting negative press, possibly letting bad things through instead of being too aggressive on the good things. So there's certainly reasons for Apple to want to keep the review times high for all these kind of accessory benefits they get from it. And it really does seem like for the last 8 years, they have just thought that 1 week was good enough, and that was a good balance of all these factors, according to them. And developers have kind of just gotten used to it and have just. I was resigned to accepting that it would just always be about a week because they obviously were targeting that, and so that was just the way it was. It was always going to be forever. And the idea now that over the past few months, like if you look at the graph on the Shiny development thing, if you look at the graph, like it hasn't been like a dramatic drop just yesterday. It's been like a pretty straight downward slope for the last few months, basically since Phil took over. And it's probably related, although Phil already ran that department before. So like Phil already was the head of the department that contains app review. So he was already the top of that before. So presumably he could have, he probably could have adjusted this before and didn't, because he probably thought he was probably the one who made the decision that 7 days was a good target. So there are changes afoot. Like because it has not just been like all of a sudden in like a day it's been like this, because it's been this kind of steady progression downwards over the last few months. I think it's more likely that this is intentional and that this is possibly the new goal, possibly here to stay. And that will just have tremendous effects on our development, because like I remember back when App Review, back when the App Store started and App Review settled pretty quickly into this 1 week delay. I said a number of times back then, like, because back then iOS developers had not quite resigned ourselves that this is like the inevitable forever state. And we were like, oh, App Review is terrible. There should be no App Review. We should have direct access and be able to update as much as we want, just like people could always do on the Mac, etc. And at the time, I remember saying, like, there's a huge difference between having a short App Review and having a long App Review. And the longer it takes, generally, like, the more of a burden it places on developers and the more of like a slowing effect it has on technological progress, on development, and on your ability to ship quality software. I remember even saying back then, 7 days is, we can tolerate this, but it would be totally different if it was 24 hours. And now it appears that after 8 years, they are actually changing it so that it is 24 hours. And I never thought this would happen. I am very happy about it. It will change the way we do things, and not all of those things will be for the better, but I think most of them will. I don't know. I mean, what do you think? How will this change? I mean, your special case also, because you do so many apps. How do you think this will change the way you work?
So I was trying to think through how this changes things, and the biggest, I think that it has different impacts on different kinds of updates that I'm trying to do. And it's also probably worth, one thing I looked up ahead of time was I was curious what the current adoption rate for updates is recently. Since iOS 7, there's been automatic app updates. So, customers don't have to go to the App Store and hit update anymore. Like, for most people, it just happens.
Although I believe that's off by default, isn't it?
If it is, then a lot of people are turning it on or going to the App Store a lot. Because what I saw is that for me, I'm seeing about 3 days to get 80% of people updated to the latest version. Because that's also an important thing to keep in mind. Because even if the app update cycle is a day, it's still a while until that update will be running on all of your customers' apps. But it's still a pretty substantial change if, say, we're going to a world where 80% of your customers get the update 4 days, 1 day for app review, 3 days for actually updating it on their phone, versus 11, 12, 13 days. Like, that's a pretty substantial change. But that's, so good to keep in mind that, so within about, 3 or 4 days, I can get people doing things. For small changes, like bug fixes, I ship an update and I get a crash report back, something like that. Some situation where there's this little change that is obviously wrong with what's currently out there. This changes the dynamic for me a lot for looking at it and saying, well, maybe I'll just do like a 0.01 release, 0.02 release, 0.03 release, like doing the more iterative model in terms of these little fixes, when I used to look at those kind of updates and I'd bundle them together because, a lot of those fixes really are short and simple and kind of verifiably correct. You'll find the line of code where, what am I thinking? I have an off by one error. I have an out of bounds error, like something that is just obvious and fixable. And I want to get that out to my customers as quick as I could. But, going through a 1 week process when I can't submit any other changes, it usually didn't make sense. And so I tend to bundle these things up and then, do a big, sort of a bigger submission. And, when that one came out, maybe I'll do another one. But the cadence of that was very much, I'd be doing maybe an update or two a month. But you could imagine a world where you would do updates much more regularly. In many ways, it's much sort of like you imagine with web development, where you can do releases on a fairly regular basis. And as a result, your average lifespan of a known bug will drop dramatically. You discover a bug, you fix a bug, you ship that out to your customers. So for small changes, it seems like that's something that I'll have to think through. On bigger releases, it sort of changes things. I think the biggest thing that it changes is if it can become consistently around a day or two, then when I'm doing a big update, something that I'm trying to market around, something that I'm trying to get attention for, it'll be great to have some better sense of, if I put it in review, it'll be approved or rejected within 24 hours. Say that was like what this becomes. And I really hope Apple doesn't change their mind on this, and this is just some kind of cruel experiment. But if this is actually the new reality, then that changes that a lot, because I can submit my update, I can get it approved, and I can coordinate my marketing, versus the thing that I end up having to kind of do now, where I submit it and I say, like, tell people in the press and talk to people and say, hey, sometime in the next 7 to 10 days, I hope it'll be approved. And, if you can write an article about it, that would be great. But like, the worst thing on those updates is if it gets rejected. And if you get a rejection and then getting the rejection re-reviewed takes a week, like, suddenly you can end up, with something that you hoped was going to be 1 week can become 3 weeks or more. And so turning that around to, you get rejected, you resubmit, you get approved, and that's 2 days rather than 2 weeks, is just massive for release planning for big, marketing pushes and things like that.
Yeah, like the rejection thing, I think, is one of the biggest savings here, because I just like especially if you're submitting a brand new app, Apple's going to nitpick a lot of things that you might not have thought of, or they're going to disagree with you on something that's kind of near the edge of a rule or something. Rejection is a multiplier of this app review time, where, like, if it is not uncommon for a 1.0 of an app to get rejected 1 to 3 times before one finally gets approved, with little changes here and there. The more you go near third rails, like in-app purchase or pay services, like, the more likely that is to happen. But either way, like, you always had to plan, like, this app I'm planning to launch might get rejected 1 to 3 times before I can launch it. So now your buffer, which used to be like, well, this is probably going to be in the store sometime in the next month, can now shrink down to, this can probably be in the store sometime in the next week. And that is substantially better. It dramatically decreases the cost of rejection. And it also decreases how bad it is if Apple wrongly rejects you.
This is true. Yeah. And I'm delighted that I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around some of the changes, because I think about this and I combine it with thinking recently about the business models and the things that are along those sides in the App Store, where, things like paid updates, which we don't have, would make bundling up changes into large things make a lot of sense. Sort of the model of software where your version number, it's like you have a 1.0 and then a year later you have a 2.0, and that kind of a model, which in this, I would say, feels fairly outdated at this point. Changes too dramatically if there's no incentive on the business side to bundle up your changes, and if releasing updates becomes really lightweight and straightforward, it's kind of like this is a situation you end up with. I think this is what Chrome does with the browser, where, like, there's just a new version all the time, or even a scenario where I think I don't actually use the Facebook app, but I believe it's just sort of every week gets an update and the number goes bigger or something along those lines. I've heard of a lot of sort of software companies moving to that kind of a model where you just ship on a very regular basis, and the product just sort of always gets better rather than there being these discontinuities in updates. That rather than having these big moments where the customers have to be like, whoa, what's going on? And, sometimes you'll still have those if you're doing a big UI refresh or something like that. But in general, if the app is just sort of always getting better, if it's getting updated in the background behind the user, you can kind of get into a very interesting pattern there that kind of completely gets away from the concept of like, oh, I'm working on my next big 3.0. It's like, no, the app is just always getting better. And I don't need to break them up into these big updates because updates are lightweight. They're like this very simple thing that, it's, even if there was no app review, like the difference between a day and 0 days is fairly minor because the majority of the time is going to be spent in getting people to actually go and download it from the App Store, like to get the new software anyway. So as long as that number is on that very low end, it's dwarfed by the update rate. And so it's essentially free to do, which hopefully Apple, can adapt to, because I would imagine the rate will necessarily go up. But I mean, the Android store has had essentially no app review. Well, they have app review, but it doesn't take time. So, I'm not entirely sure on the details of that, but I remember they famously announced that they had added app review to the Google Play Store, but nobody noticed.
Yeah, I think it takes like a few hours to a day, something like that, but it's short.
And that works, and that's great. And if that's our world too now, that's kind of wild. I would love the worst thing, and I think you ran into this recently with an Overcast update, where you ship an update that all your testing, all these things, you missed a pretty substantial bug. Mm-hmm. A data loss bug, something that's crushing your server, something like some kind of really heinous bug. And previously, for those things, we would have to go and do get on our knees and beg Apple, hey, please give me an expedited review. And Apple was usually pretty good about that. In my years, I've requested probably a handful of those. They've always granted them. I mean, the email you get back was always a bit comical because it has this kind of we'll make a special one-time exception for you. You shouldn't rely on this. It's like poor. It's like sort of this kind of very condescending email you'd get back. But whatever, I don't mind being condescended to if that meant that my app got approved in a few hours. And this kind of terrible bug, I've shipped updates where. It's like if you launch that particular version, it would start corrupting your database or things like these things happen and they're terrible. But I almost wonder if Apple would still have the expedited system in a world of, if it's a 1 day review cycle, if you can, request a 1 hour review, I don't even know if that would even make sense. But it's lovely to think that at worst, it would be a day before I could get something out.
No, I mean, it takes them about a day to respond to those requests. So it's I think that actually might be a sign. If they end up eliminating the expedited review system, I think that would be a sign that they intend to keep the review times this low. Because with the review times being approximately a day, that system doesn't make sense anymore. There's no gain there because it takes about a day to get the expedited reviews. So yeah, that would be great. This really would, many of the problems of app review are proportional to the time it takes app review to happen. And so, you don't get rid of all the issues with app review by having short review times, but you do make a lot of them a lot smaller of a problem. And so this is great. Anyway, we are sponsored this week by Braintree. Go to braintreepayments.com/radar. Why make payment integration more difficult than it has to be? Braintree's powerful full-stack payment platform allows you to accept nearly any type of payment from any device with just one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs and supports most languages. Whether you're using Java, Ruby, or Python, you'll always have a range of server-side and client-side SDKs available. This code supports Android, iOS, and JavaScript clients, and this takes just 10 lines of code to implement Braintree. Now, by next year, maybe even next week, there could be a whole new way to pay. Maybe it'll be the next Bitcoin, the next Apple Pay, maybe both. Fortunately, Braintree's full-stack payment platform is easily adaptable to whatever the future holds, so you can adapt easily too. Accept everything from Pounds to PayPal to the next big innovation from any device with just this one integration. And when that next payment method comes out, all you have to do is update a few lines of code. No late nights, no complicated recoding, no stress about staying ahead of the curve. Braintree is here to help. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. Learn more at braintreepayments.com/radar. Thank you very much to Braintree for supporting Under the Radar and all of Relay FM. So I wanted to also mention the impact this has both ways on quality. So like for me, I've mentioned before, like I stress out like crazy when doing a release. And part of the reason I stress out is what you mentioned earlier of like, I know that if I screwed up something big time, it's going to take me a week to get a fix out there. And that's just horrible. And like worst case scenario, if the app, it's something's really bad, like a data loss bug, I'm gonna have to pull the app from the store until I can get a fix out there and lose like a week of sales. I've never had to do that, but it's always been like kind of like the fail safe in the back of my mind. Like, well, I might someday have to do that if it's really bad.
I've had to do that.
Yeah, it's bad, right?
I pulled an app from the store for a week, and it's just like, well, that's that.
Yeah, like that's a huge dent in your income and in the app's growth and usage, and sucks for the customers. So yeah, so like I've always had in the back of my mind, like, man, if I screw this up, this is going to take me a week to fix. And if it only takes me a day to fix, that's a pretty big difference. And so the faster you can get updates out, the more, the lower stress it is, but also I think the more likely I might be to let my standards slip of like testing and quality assurance to be like, because before, like, if you've ever rejected a binary more than 24 hours after you submitted it, then if you think about it in this new system, that would have shipped to customers. And I've done that a few times. Yeah. I did that like 2 weeks ago.
Sure.
So, I feel like this will. This is a double-edged sword. It will increase the ability for us to get fixes out there and to improve quality and to be faster. But I think it will also increase the likelihood that we ship bad bugs. And it's going to take a certain degree of self-control, of quality assurance, of good rigorous practices to prevent that. One of the weird side effects of this is that right now, getting your app approved through the App Store takes roughly the same amount of time or even less than getting test flight beta approval for the first version of the beta that you ship in test flight. So hopefully that's a temporary hiccup, and hopefully that will change, maybe to the point of getting rid of test flight review entirely, because it doesn't make a lot of sense, and especially in this world, because like basically right now, I am more incentivized to just update the app for everybody than I am to run a beta. Because running a beta will take way longer now than just getting the update out there.
Which is very strange. And I think it also, I was thinking too, like one of the things when I was talking about this online, the comment I got back was this like, well, this is just going to make people use the public as their QA department, which I think is sort of what you're saying. It's like, well, I may as well just ship it out into the world, and if there are bugs, people will tell me and I'll submit an update and we'll go back round and round. And I mean, I guess that the reality is that may be true, and for some people that may happen. But I think overall, like the average quality will still go up, because it's like our ability to sort of ask them, like in a lot of ways, I think of software quality. It's like you're trying to get to say, like for some arbitrary measure, say it's like crash-free users, which is I think the way Fabric and Crashlytics measure it. It's like I want that line to approach 100%. And the faster I can iterate on it, the faster I'm going to get it there. And so while some reality, because I think viewing like public QA as a bad thing, like it can be, but the reality is a lot of bugs can only be found in the wild. If beta testing and internal QA were perfect, then we wouldn't need a crash reporter. I wouldn't need Crashlytics in my apps. I would have just caught all the bugs before I shipped it. But like that's not the reality. Like and especially any app that involves user data in any way, Like I have a recipe book app, and sometimes I find some very strange and interesting bugs that are caused by issues that I just wouldn't have. I could never even dreamed of or imagined would be issues, but it's like that's just the way people are using using the data, or it's their particular language or character set has a weird quirk that causes a strange issue.
See also our episode number 16, Designing for Misuse.
Yes, exactly. Like some of these things you're only going to find, but for me, like there is definitely, I have to keep, I think it's a good cautionary word to keep in the back of our minds that just because app review is quick and fixing a potential bug is more lightweight, we still have to have the discipline of keeping ourselves to high standards, that we're not just going to like, oh, we'll just ship it and fix it in, sort of fix it in post kind of mindset. But if we embrace the ability of what that means, if we keep our standards high, the overall quality can get to that much higher and, much more higher quality level so much faster. It's sort of in the way that I think of in some ways like iOS updates, like iOS, big major updates where Apple doesn't update once a year with, a few point releases along the way. That's a much slower process necessarily to getting towards really high quality overall, because it just takes longer. And so there's a much higher period where things aren't going to be as good.
Yeah. And I think, and we can see, like, it's not like this is going to be the first platform ever that has fast app updates available. Like, we can see from existing platforms, the Mac, the web, maybe Android, I don't know. But, you can see from other platforms what happens when developers can update their software whenever they want. And the answer is some products become like crashing, unstable, and changing every day, but most don't. Most just have releases that are carefully issued when they need to be, and like most of my Mac apps don't update themselves every day. It's fine. Like they wait until they have a solid release and then they update them. Web apps tend to be the same way, where like you're generally not noticing changes every single day to web apps that you use. They're generally not like crashing constantly because everyone's running untested code. Like people just have discipline and good practices, and they figure out how to make it work. And I think iOS is going to be the same way. As this time stays down, if it stays down, as we hope it does, then we're just going to see, just in the long run, better software. And there might be some hiccups along the way as some developers get a little bit too careless with it, but I think that will iron itself out fairly soon, and it'll just be great. And I just, assuming this stays here, I could not be happier that they're making changes like this, because this means that they care and that they recognize that the previous system was not as good as it can be.
Exactly. And I like honest, genuine thanks to, if anybody who happens to listen to the show happens to work in app review or know someone who works in app review, highest of fives. Like, this is awesome. This is exactly the kind of thing that is an encouragement to me as a developer, especially as a smaller developer, that there are changes afoot, that things we've been talking about for a while, that the App Store is a trickier and trickier place to make a business and to make a run at. And these changes in some ways are small, but they are impactful in terms of they allow me to ship better product more easily, and that's awesome. And so thank you.
Also, big congrats to the app review team for the amazing degree of like secrecy that they have. Like, I've through my web presence and everything else, I have met a lot of Apple contacts or heard from a lot of Apple people from every department you can think of in the company, except app review. I have never heard from or met or heard about anybody who either worked in app review or who even knew anybody who worked in app review. That's pretty crazy. That's saying a lot. Anyway, so good job on them. They're more secret than the car. Yeah. Anyway, so congrats, app review. Thank you for doing this. Please keep it up. We are looking forward to this being our new reality. I believe that's all the time we have for this week. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you, Phil Schiller. You're amazing. And please keep this. And we'll talk to you guys next week.
Bye.